Good morning and welcome to the 13th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. We have apologies from Mark Griffin. So our main item of business today is to begin taking oral evidence for our inquiry into financial considerations when leaving an abusive relationship. Before we begin, I would like to thank the staff at Financially Included for hosting a visit for committee members. It was invaluable to hear about the significant impact of the organisation has on the lives of individual women and to learn more about the kinds of situations women who are dealing with economic abuse face. And I would also like to pass on the committee's sincere thanks to the women from the Scottish Women's Aid Survivor Reference Group for taking the time to comment on the committee's call for views on the inquiry and to tell us about their experiences of financial abuse. We'll hear from two panels of witnesses today, and I welcome our first panel of witnesses to the meeting. So we have Lindsay Cleland, Policy Officer, Age Scotland, Stuart Duffin, Chief Executive Officer and Company Secretary, Counselling Services, Glasgow. And we're joined by Dr Jen Glinsky, National Policy Lead for Economic Abuse, Scottish Women's Aid, who is joining us online. So thank you very much for joining us today. So I'm now going to invite members to pose some questions to yourself. So first of all, we're going to touch upon sources of advice and information. So what type of advice and information do victims and survivors need on the financial considerations of leaving an abusive relationship? And what would it take to ensure that this is available throughout Scotland in a trauma-informed and accessible way? And I'm going to invite Stuart in first of all, if he would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we're a counselling service, so we tend to see the survivors of economic abuse after the events and episodes have happened. So our observations are in relation to that and what guidance and advice would have supported a person leaving an abusive relationship. I think the key element for that is to look at trauma-informed services across the third sector, but also in terms of legal services and money advice services and even local authorities in looking at that, because many of our clients have said that going to those services, they've been re-traumatised in terms of the economic abuse, and therefore they've withdrawn and gone back into their shell. So it's really important, I think, to have that trauma-informed training across Scotland. I think the second sort of element there is about building resilience. Many people come to us with anxiety and stress in economic abuse episodes. And it's about building that resilience, building back their confidence. It's about building back, for instance, a credit record, which they may not have ever had. It's about being able to go along to banks, etc., and talk openly about these things. So it's really important that economic abuse in the wider society and wider business world is recognised and fully understood. So again, that is what I would say that is the guidance that's needed in terms of going forward to resolve or help to resolve issues in economic abuse.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. That's been helpful. Lindsay, I don't know if you would like to comment.
Yes, so we're from Age Scotland and national charity for over 50s in Scotland, and where we are coming from this is a perspective. People don't necessarily come to us looking for specialist domestic abuse advice, but we hear about it through the conversation when they're looking at needing support for applying for housing, applying for social security benefits. They are low income, they're just on a state pension and trying to maximise that. And in conversation with our advisors, their helpline, it becomes clear and apparent that that's a domestic abuse situation which they are trying to leave or have just left. So that's kind of perspective that we're coming from. Again, we hear from particularly older women that if they have been in a relationship for a long time and it's been traditional that their partner deals with all of the finances, not only bank accounts and payments, but things like bills and utilities, they really struggle with finding out how they can do that themselves. There's not a lot of information out there which is easily accessible. A lot of it is online as well, which is something that we very much struggle with across the board, and hear from older people that they are digitally excluded. But a lot of resources around domestic abuse, economic abuse, how to apply for certain things is all online. And if you're not in that space and you're not confident, or you've never had the ability to learn those skills in a safe space, there's a real struggle with how they can access that. So the kind of things we would recommend is making sure that, as Stuart says, across the board, services from third sector, housing, occupational therapy, who might go in, carers who speak to older people, GP services, private sector, particularly places like banks and post offices where people might go in person to try and set up these services, are trained in the signs and symptoms of domestic abuse, trauma informed, so that they know how to engage with people who have experienced this without, as Stuart says, re-traumatising them or having to explain their situation over and over and over again. But also that this information on, you know, specialist domestic abuse services or how you can apply for social security is in spaces in person where older people go and actually do get the chance to maybe access these without a partner being there. For a lot of older women, they are isolated within their home. A partner or both of them are retired, so being able to go online in the home or phone up someone in the home is very difficult. But out at a pharmacy, a GP practice, a supermarket where there are safe spaces in place, actually having those services advertised and signposting and other information available to them in those places where they go and they might have that freedom to do so would be really helpful, and make that accessible to people that just can't get it elsewhere.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thanks very much, Lindsay. I believe Jen would like to come in.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you very much for having me. I would just like to echo what my panel members have said. I just want to reiterate that leaving an abusive partner is it's an enormous emotional, physical, and logistical process, which is fundamentally related to safety. Now, we know that lack of finances and economic resources are often a key barrier to facilitate this physical separation, but also to remain separated and to rebuild lives after abuse. One of the things that we're finding where we simply must increase our understanding across the board, and my colleagues have already mentioned other systems as well, is that when the relationship ends, the abuse does not end. And with economic abuse in particular, victim survivors will go on to either experience it for the first time, experience continued economic abuse, or it will escalate. And that financial link that that perpetrator is able to keep to them post-separation is something that we need to try to sever. Victim survivors need clear, practical, and trauma-informed advice on a wide range of financial topics. Now, the other panel members have already mentioned these things, but we need to increase our awareness and understanding of economic abuse during the relationship, at the point of separation, when someone is contemplating physically separating, giving them support at that point in time as well as post-separation economic abuse. They need housing advice on what will happen to joint tenancies or to joint mortgages in particular, eviction risks. They also need benefits advice as well as employment and income advice and support. Legal advice. I know we've recently had gaps pointed out to us in articles by the BBC as well in terms of how difficult it is to obtain legal advice, and as part of that, immigration advice as well. I'm very pleased that Lindsay is mentioning women who are 50 and over and the barriers that they face in addition. But we also know that women with NRPF face significant barriers to receiving this kind of support because they simply do not qualify for certain benefits, and it's difficult to obtain the immigration advice as well. We also need financial support and banking advice, and with that, specialist debt advice. And just to build upon the other arguments already made, it is incredibly important that we recognize that no one service currently exists that will be able to provide all of this information. So we do need a whole systems response from a variety of public, private, and third sector parties, and a response that is consistent and joined up in their understanding of economic abuse and its continued impact on women and children. For this, we need dedicated, sustainable funding, centralised and consistent messaging around economic abuse, specialist training across all sectors, and as well, and I'm very pleased to hear Lindsay say that as well, accessible and inclusive information. A lot of it is available online. A lot of it is also not particular and specific to Scotland and the context and the differences that exist here compared to England and Wales and Northern Ireland. So having options where information can be handed out in a variety of different forms. We, for example, have added WhatsApp chat to the domestic abuse and forced marriage helpline, and we have found that to be an incredibly popular way for victim survivors to get in touch with us, especially women from an older cohort. So this shows that these different ways of getting in touch and having information provided is incredibly important, especially with something that we're finding there's not a huge amount of awareness about already.
Can I just on what you sort of touched upon, just going back to you, Jen, you find that there's been a bigger increase in the reporting of the domestic abuse to some of the services that you've touched upon, or is it because is it an increase, or is there better awareness of it?
I think it's probably a mix of both. As with anything, when it comes to having an increase in reporting, it can indicate increased confidence. But even this very committee right now and what you're doing with this inquiry, it indicates that the terms economic abuse and financial abuse, they are gaining awareness, they are gaining traction. One of the big barriers to seeking support for this is that many simply do not view it as a form of domestic abuse. So when there is that bit of information that's available that actually says when your partner or your ex-partner is exploiting your income, is not allowing you to access benefits, is taking your money, and exploiting your resources. People are now identifying with that and are trying to report that and seek support for it. Oftentimes with economic abuse in particular, and one of the big outcomes from that is coerced debt, and I'm happy to go into more context about that, but you often do not know about the coerced debt until you're trying to separate, and that's because you're looking at your finances and you're looking to see what it is that you need in order to facilitate the separation. And that's oftentimes when you find out that there has been debt taken out in your name fraudulently, or that you've been forced into taking out debt, that then prevents you from taking those further steps and acts as a barrier to separation. So I think it's probably a good mix of both. People are starting to identify it more as a form of domestic abuse. We've seen progress as well, for example, from financial institutions that are speaking about it a little bit more publicly and about support that's available for your finances. Whereas before, people might just simply think, this is just how my relationship is. Money's tight. That is just what this looks like. And now they're beginning to understand, and there's more awareness raising around it, that this actually is a form of domestic abuse and it is a form of coercive and controlling behaviour.
Okay, Jen, thanks very much. I think Stuart wants to come back in, and then I'm going to pass over to Gordon MacDonald. Thank you.
I hesitate to say this, but I think one of the benefits of COVID was that people have become greater aware of well-being and mental health issues and are willing to talk about issues more. But also, there's a greater awareness about economic abuse isn't an event. It's a psychological process of coercion over a period of time. And also people are beginning to recognise that their independence is being compromised and quality of life is being compromised, and they want to regain that. So it's the combination of all of those things that have actually made the reporting of economic abuse far greater.
Oh, that's helpful, thank you. I'm now going to invite Gordon MacDonald. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Convener. When any relationship breaks down, there has to be interaction with a whole range of organisations, whether it's utility companies, housing associations, local authorities and so on. So I'm keen to understand to what extent are mainstream organisations aware of the impact of financial and economic abuse? And Stuart, I'll come to you first.
I think it's limited. I think, what we have seen in terms of working with our client group and referring them on to other agencies that have for more specialist support. There's almost an education process that we have to do with those organisations about economic abuse, and also looking at the issues around confidence and resilience. So I think there's a whole systemic approach needed in creating an awareness programme, an education programme, a training programme, even in an individual level as well as organisational level. And we're seeing that being integrated into professional qualifications, such as solicitors, such as social workers, healthcare workers, etc. So we need to see that as a foundational aspect of professional training as well.
Okay. Jen, you, just before I come to you, I was surprised to find out that the Child Maintenance Service and some of the evidence we heard said the people who had to deal with the Child Maintenance Service said it accounts for cases. It says it accounts for cases of domestic abuse, but in reality, it was just signposting. So, what's your views about what we have to do about raising awareness?
Sorry, are you asking this in particular in relation to child maintenance or more widely?
Well, just more widely.
So, based on information from our Survivor Reference Group, the Domestic Abuse and Forced Marriage Helpline, as well as from my own research in economic abuse in Scotland, I will have to again echo what's been said, that victim survivors currently feel that the awareness, understanding and response to economic abuse is inconsistent at best across mainstream services. Some have mentioned that there are services that do have detailed knowledge of it, that are trauma-informed, that are very focused on not re-traumatizing and speaking about finances and domestic abuse. But equally, they have also come across services where they have found that that is simply not the case and that there's a significant lack of awareness of what economic abuse is and the tactics that it entails. Some victim survivors have shared with us that unfortunately they thought the response from the police in particular was very disappointing upon disclosing forms of economic abuse, especially when there had not been other forms of domestic or physical or sexual abuse. And it was common to be told that this was not a criminal issue, it was a civil matter, and that they would be better off contacting their banks instead. Similarly, we've heard from workers in our network, from the Women's Aid Network across Scotland, that they're also not always, entirely sure who to signpost women to, with financial institutions, debt and benefits advisors being most frequently referred to. However, then there is an ongoing concern of, with the signposting, will the person that they have been signposted to have a detailed understanding of economic abuse? Will the woman have to go and retell her story over and over and over again, sometimes even within the same institutions, which, as we know, can be re-traumatizing instead of having a joined-up response and say this once. So we know that advisors are saying that there are concerns about the level of awareness of domestic abuse and economic abuse as part of it. As I mentioned at the beginning as well, one of the things that victim survivors have said there's a real lack of awareness of is around post-separation economic abuse, so that you could potentially be seeking support, be in the right place, but that support workers sometimes lack the understanding that it is continuing and that is something that needs continuous safeguarding as well, and that is across all mainstream services. To your point, just quickly in terms of child maintenance, I'm afraid that is not surprising. We know we have long highlighted issues within the child maintenance service, and we know from working with victim survivors and with our network that child maintenance can be and is exploited by abusive ex-partners, that oftentimes, even in order to move through the child maintenance portal, you have to say that you have not experienced domestic abuse in order to move through the portal. Now, that's re-traumatizing. Again, some people are not aware that economic abuse and financial abuse are forms of domestic abuse, but in order to obtain support, to have to say that you haven't experienced domestic abuse is quite shocking. But abusive ex-partners are able to use the child maintenance service to further deplete the financial resources for women and ultimately for their children. So we know that abusive partners withhold payments, that sometimes they make very minimal payments, leave it until the very last minute to make these payments, which, as you might appreciate, can cause severe anxiety and concern around finances if you are reliant on that child maintenance to provide for your child, but also that they have used it in an extensive way to sometimes make payments and include other forms of abuse, such as emotional and psychological abuse, by attaching abusive messages to these payments. And that is something that I think financial institutions in particular have become very aware of and can provide evidence for.
You mentioned the organisations that don't get it right. Are there any organisations that do get it right?
We are finding that some victim survivors have had positive experiences with their financial institutions, that they noticed that there was perhaps a specialist team with specialist training that was trauma competent and domestic abuse competent and had awareness. And that women have had examples of having coerced debt, for example, limited or decreased or written off entirely. But it really depends. And I think that's part of the issue, is that it depends on any given day who you get and what their knowledge level is like in order to receive adequate and accessible support.
Okay, Lindsay?
Yes, thank you. I would just echo what my fellow panellists have said around it is patchy and inconsistent. From local authority services, 32 local authorities, every single one doing various things differently. Some teams are having that specialist trauma-informed training, some aren't. Even within teams, it can be, for example, housing. Some teams will get this, like children and families, but independent living won't get it. So there's a very inconsistent approach, and there does need to be that systematic sector-wide approach so that it becomes a foundational part of training. But also I would just add as well that the training must include the signs and symptoms and the impacts on domestic abuse across various groups of women. We've heard from older women as well who've experienced this, that sometimes they've gone to services looking for support to set something up, and it has been dismissed almost that, you know, that's just a part of your relationship, or when they've gone to speak about abuse that they've been facing, it's been palmed off as symptoms of ageing, you know, forgetfulness, which has actually been severe gaslighting by a partner because of their age that's been dismissed. So it's really just about that holistic approach and saying that actually abuse can manifest itself in different ways, in different relationships, particularly in later life as well, and making sure that services are informed of that. And just to Jen's point around that kind of telling over and over again, we very much hear that as well, that people are trying to speak to services, even if they speak to, on the same phone call, they might speak to 3 different people and get 3 different messages and then have to tell that story over and over and over again. And it's just a traumatising experience, which means that they don't actually seek that help at the next point because they've already had such a poor experience trying to do it in the first place. To your point on good examples, I think some of like third sector local groups are doing really well and taking up some of the training that's offered by places like Scottish Women's Aid and Hourglass, who specialise in the abuse of older people, but not consistently and not as far reaching as it should be to make this work.
You mentioned that, I'll come to you in a minute, Stuart. You mentioned the fact that it's a bit patchy across the 32 local authorities and the organisations that operate within them. Scottish Governments came up with a strategy, Equally Safe, which includes a commitment to develop a national framework for training. I mean, what do you think that will achieve? Are you confident that it will address the financial and economic abuse that you've highlighted?
As I said, if it's trauma-informed, inclusive of all different types of domestic abuse that might appear across various demographics and various types of relationships, and that's embedded as a foundation, everyone who starts to work in a local authority team gets this training, and also that it's not lost as well. We've heard that when people have moved on from teams, retired, etc., all of that knowledge and experience and information is lost and not passed down to teams. So as long as there's a structured approach to that and it is foundational and that doesn't get lost, it's not a one and done type training, it's continuous, it's ongoing, it's passed down, it's specialist trauma informed from various organisations who have the experience of dealing with different groups of women, whether that be ethnic minorities, older women, travellers, so that it's fully holistic. That will go some way, but it does need to be done right, and it has to be from the start and ongoing.
Okay, Stuart.
Yeah, I'd just like to come in. I think one of the key issues is about the burden of evidence, because the burden of evidence in terms of economic abuse varies dramatically across the sectors, healthcare, local authorities, third sector, banks, etc. So I think looking at some form of framework of definition or even a code of guidance or a code of practice in terms of the burden of evidence what is required would actually help and would actually give some guidance in dealing with economic abuse across Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Jen?
Oh, sorry, I hadn't.
Just on the question about the... Sorry, my voice is going.
About the national framework and Equally Safe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Equally Safe and its delivery plan are robust and flexible frameworks designed to accommodate new learning, emerging needs, responding to emerging needs, and to embed these in future delivery. And I think we are at this point where economic and financial abuse is one such area. So we have Equally Safe in Practice, for example, at Scottish Women's Aid, which we work with. And that exists to support and strengthen the practice of the Scottish workforce so that it is consistent. And like I said, the framework is flexible. We've seen, inclusion of tech abuse more recently, and to say that, the framework is now being built around that to respond to it more effectively. So I don't see any reason why economic and financial abuse would be any different.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I wonder, just before I move on to another area, if I can go back to Jen in regard to the child maintenance issue. I'm interested to know, is this the way that it's been set up is the issue, so it's a kind of structural issue, or is there an issue in regard to the legislation that was passed to bring in the child maintenance? So I'm interested to know whether it can be changed in regard to just procedures, or is it a more fundamental issue that your clients facing?
I am able to answer the structural part. I would have to come back to you, if it's okay, with a written response in terms of the legislative. In terms of what victim survivors are telling us and support workers who help with the applications of child maintenance, it appears to be very much structural. It's embedded. In fact, most people will say child maintenance doesn't work for either party. But what we are finding is that it is very difficult to raise issues of domestic abuse, that it is very difficult to change claims as well. In terms of, by this I mean, we've heard from victim survivors that the abusive ex-partner has said that they are the parent who have the children, and that the victim survivor should be the paying parent, and then it takes an incredibly long time, if at all, in order to say that actually the mother in this case has the children. They are not the paying parent; they should be the receiving parent. But for some reason, there are just structural barriers to having this changed. In addition, women have also found that, as Lindsay and I have already mentioned, the retelling of one's story within the same service. I know there have been suggestions that clients of child maintenance now get a named person who will work with their case consistently. But at this point in time, it's victim survivors' experiences that they have to retell their story multiple times. Again, this requires awareness that you have experienced domestic and financial abuse. It requires awareness that it will continue or can escalate post-separation, and safeguarding around that. So again, from any given day, it depends on the advisor that you have, the training that they've received, and if they are trauma-informed and domestic abuse aware and competent. So these all point to serious structural issues. The fact that, again, ex-partners can refuse to pay, have a court mandate to pay, but refuse to pay, make minimal payments, and that there seems to be little to no repercussions for the perpetrator in this scenario is also something that we're acutely aware of, and that seems to be no way to address this and to get the economic justice for children, because ultimately this is who child maintenance is meant for, and the withholding of that by the abusive partner means that we are seeing increased levels of poverty, of child poverty, and of children struggling because they're simply not receiving the resources that they're entitled to and that they're meant to receive.
Thank you. That's very helpful. If I can now move on in regard to kind of the issue around housing, and maybe again just come back to you, Jen, if that's okay. What are the implications for the victim or survivor of the current availability and cost of housing and refuge places, and what do you think needs to change?
I think it will be no secret to anyone here in this committee and on the panel that there is a significant housing shortage in Scotland, and this includes the availability of safe, accessible and affordable housing for victim survivors of domestic abuse and their children, and that includes refuges. So women and children are therefore forced to remain with an abusive partner, try to remove the abusive partner from that property, which often escalates the risk of abuse, sofa surf, or declare themselves homeless in order to unlock some support for housing. And I really do want to just reiterate that point that women and children are purposely having to declare themselves homeless and become destitute in order to try to secure housing. The situation is even more dire for women with no recourse to public funds. They do not have access to housing benefits, and often because of economic and financial abuse, which occurs in most all situations where there is domestic abuse, they will not have the income to pay for refuges. Women with NRPF, particularly women with no children who are NRPF, are therefore often forced to choose between remaining with an abusive partner or becoming homeless or destitute, which we believe is no choice at all. The lack of financial support for women is a barrier to accessing a women's aid refuge. As a result, even women who may be employed or have savings will have to pay for a refuge, and they will struggle to make the costs of that refuge. So one thing that I'd like to just point out is that when you do flee, when you do physically separate, and often that entails leaving your own property, it does not mean that the day-to-day costs of living go away. So oftentimes, especially for women who are in employment or who have savings, you're also faced with still paying for the previous property. You're potentially paying for a refuge space, which is incredibly expensive, as well as maintaining the day-to-day costs of another property and all other living expenses. You don't simply go into refuge and the financial burden of existing lifts. We also see that perpetrators often remain in the residence, but as part of the economic abuse, they will then refuse to cover these costs and instead hold the victim survivor responsible for payments. I know that Scottish Women's Aid was actively involved in the creation of improving housing outcomes for women and children, and this contains a variety of recommendations on how to improve the housing situation for women and children. This includes reviewing, for example, specialist refuge provision and developing it to meet international standards for a number of spaces, distribution, and suitability. And that includes a specific provision for BME women and women with NRPF. So I'd be very happy to provide a link on that for you to have a further look at the recommendations.
I mean, thank you. I think that would be helpful if you could provide that. Lindsay, I don't know if you have anything further to add.
Yes, I would reiterate everything that Dr Glinski said as well, but also just to provide some context about what might make it more difficult for particularly older or disabled women to leave is that, we all know that there's a housing crisis and there's a shortage of housing, and there's particularly a shortage of suitably accessible and adapted housing. There's a very long wait list to get these kinds of properties. Adaptations can be expensive as well. They may have already spent a lot of money adapting the property they are currently in, and that is a massive barrier to leaving because you have to consider all of these other things that you need to live safely and independently while trying to find new housing as well. There's also the barrier that many older people have kind of lived in a home that they own, and their housing costs have been slightly lower. And it's not the case for every older person, but if that has been your situation and you're then having to look into moving into the social housing sector or the private rented sector, that's hundreds of pounds every single month that you've not had to budget for before, and you potentially don't have the income for as well if you're reliant on state pension, which is often lower for women who have been out of work for childcare or other caring reasons, and the structural inequality of state pension and the way it's set up. Typically women are a lot lower, and oftentimes men have 9 times worth of the pension that women do in later life. So it kind of sets the context for how difficult that can be for an older woman to then try and leave their property and have all these additional housing costs. And then the challenge of, does it need adapted? It needs to be accessible. Do they have to arrange a care package for themselves, and the time that would take and the potential cost of having to arrange care for themselves in the new accommodation. There's also the aspect of you might also be a carer for your partner who is abusive, and you have to think about, if I leave them, how do I pay for and arrange for care for them, because there is that feeling of a moral obligation to stay in your home and look after your partner as well, even if they are abusive. And that's extremely emotionally distressing for people as well as a financial barrier. In terms of refuge and emergency accommodation, the costs associated with that, again, another thing, but also there's a feeling of, I'm perhaps too old to be in these spaces. Do they cater for young women, families? I can't actually get a space there, so they don't even consider it as an option, and then look to to other options in the private rented sector, which can be even more expensive and challenging. So yeah, I would agree with everything Dr. Polinsky said, and just add those points around the specifics of older women.
I think we also have to recognise that economic abuse also exists in affluent families, and the issues in terms of those families that we have seen have an exponential element in terms of financial burdens in relation to that. What we've seen as well is, women do not have financial control and do not have the ability to navigate public services because they've never needed to do that before. So there is a whole issue around that. But also, many private sector landlords are looking for 3 months, if not 6 months deposits. So actually trying to get that together for a family, you're in the 5,000, 6,000, ballpark for that, and actually trying to maintain that private rent is a real challenge. And what we've seen as well is that families then make contact with their own families to borrow money. Now, we all know when borrowing money from families, relationships can go and take a nosedive. And, the pressure on repaying that becomes fairly strong. So there is an issue there about how accessing housing needs some form of public support. We've also seen that women have had to move away from the local area, so there's increased transport costs for taking kids to school, or maybe even increased cost of kids changing school and the disruption all of that causes. So there are, there are reports around, and I put it in my evidence that taking that courageous step to move out of a home can cost as much as £50,000 over the year. If you add in all the costs, all the double costs, etc., legal fees, whatever, and that is a major challenge to make that courageous decision to leave a household with your family because of economic abuse.
Thank you. So obviously, one of the things we'd like to do is keep the victim survivor in their permanent home rather than having to move out. But I wonder, how realistic is that from your experience, and what needs to happen to make that more realistic? I don't know who wants to jump in. Lindsay, I'll pick on you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very complex one, and for a lot of older women, they would prefer to stay in their own home, but I say there's complexities around that, particularly if there's care needs involved for themselves or a partner. I think what needs to work is housing teams not kind of prioritising one partner over the other, particularly if that's the partner who is named on tenancies or paying the bills, which is often the case. And treating that as equals. And I know some of the housing bill amendments will address some of this, but I think there just needs to be more of an equal approach to that. I'm not entirely sure what specifics, to be honest, would make it work, but certainly looking at both partners as equals when making decisions around these things would be a first step.
Yeah, I think, having that awareness training, having that code of practice would actually assist in terms of housing, because it's about looking at two people rather than just one. And I mean, particularly, in terms of older women tend to lack identity. So there is an element there in trying to move out of the household. You know, they don't have a credit rating. They don't, you know, the only rating that they have has been on the electoral register. Their name, you know, they don't have 2 energy bills. They don't necessarily have a phone bill or any of that. So it's beginning to look at households rather than individuals, I think, is a key issue going forward in this debate around how we can support people fleeing economic abuse. Thank you.
I believe Jen wants to come in. Jeremy, thanks.
Yes, just briefly, and building upon what the other panel members have said, we are very much in support of women and children being able to stay in their own homes if they choose to do so, as well as if it's safe for them to do so. I think one of the big things to point out here is that this does not solve everything. It is a significant step. It would be a great relief. You know, Stuart has already mentioned that you oftentimes have to change schools, you have to change employment, there's increased travel costs. You might be leaving the community that you receive support from when you have to leave your residence. However, we don't want staying in the home to be seen as the end all be all. As I said, the end of the relationship does not mean the end of the abuse, and especially for economic abuse. We have found that perpetrators, when women and children have been able to stay in their own homes and the perpetrator has left the property, that they continue, you know, their campaign of economic abuse. So we still need safeguarding against that, and for victim survivors to be aware of what this might look like, as well as then the relevant institutions and bodies being able to support with that. One example is renegotiating mortgage rates. So obviously, if both partners were paying the mortgage or had awareness of the mortgage, you're going, if you remain in it, then having to pay that singularly. So you are one person who then becomes responsible for the mortgage and your childcare and everything else. As I mentioned, the day-to-day living costs do not stop. But perpetrators will often refuse to renegotiate that mortgage rate, which would allow a victim survivor, for example, to be able to lower the mortgage rate and have that discussion with the financial institution to allow them to pay this more easily. So as you can see, there's a continued campaign there. Also, the refusal to sell the property. A victim survivor might stay in the property but wish to sell it in order to have access to greater finances, to unlock some of that money that's available in the property, and then we see ex-partners refusing to pay that, to agree to the sale of the home, but also damages to property. And we saw an increase of this during COVID as well, where people were working from home or doing childcare from home during lockdown, where there were significant damages to the property for which the victim survivor then became responsible for. So we really need to see, as you know, we've all been mentioning throughout this panel so far, is this joined up response? So an awareness of what economic abuse looks like, especially post-separation, but we need a joined up systems-wide response. And this will take multiple things to be in place: adequate financial support and advice, adequate domestic abuse informed legal support, especially entitlements around housing, and recognition from services, as I've said, that the abuse probably will continue and what this might look like in relation to the property.
Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Bob Dorison.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'll maybe come to Jen first, but just to kind of signpost, in a moment I'm going to ask about how both the UK and Scottish benefits and entitlement systems could work more effectively, what they do well, what they can improve on. That's not the question just now, but I just want to kind of set that in context so you can kind of get ready with your answers for that. I want to be quite specific about the Fund to Leave pilot that existed from up until March last year, from October 23 to March last year, £500,000 up to £1,000 per victim survivor who took that major plunge to leave home. If it was to be reintroduced, what changes would you make? And as that pilot stood, what worked well in relation to that? I think the committee would find it helpful getting some of that on the record, and then we can look at the ways in which other systems can provide financial support, which why I trailed with that one. Dr. Glinsky, could you maybe make some comments on that, please?
Yes, thank you. In terms of the fund to leave, so it was a very successful pilot. As you mentioned, it was $500,000 over a 4-month period, and the finances were available to women leaving abusive partners. So we had, the way it was set up was that 9 women's aid services delivered the fund and 5 local authorities. These were picked because we had seen the highest homelessness applications from women there because of domestic abuse. Just a brief detail, the women would be able to apply for up to £1,000 per application, and the average application was £825. In total, we received 533 applications that were accepted, and 1,109 people were helped by the fund. So you can see there that it was women and children, so from the 533 applications. What we saw was that almost 3/4 of the money received by women was spent on essentials, and this included housing, furnishings, relocation, and utilities. So all of the things that we've been talking about that you will need that money for. It led to improved housing outcomes for women and children. So over 1/3 were able to stay in their own home. Over 1/3 were able to move from temporary accommodation into permanent accommodation. And just under 1/3 were supported into refuge or temporary accommodation while more permanent options were established. So that just shows how closely it is connected to housing and the need for housing and secure and available and affordable housing. The evaluation of the fund clearly demonstrated the need for a fund that provides immediate, accessible grants to survivors to support and reduce the risk of homelessness or having to return to the abuser in order to have somewhere to live and to survive. In terms of our main recommendations, Bob, you mentioned that. So it is one of ours that the Fund to Leave becomes a permanent national fund that's available to survivors of domestic abuse who are leaving an abusive partner, and that we'd like the model to be extended to all 32 local authority areas. Also, having funds distributed through Scottish Women's Aid, working with our network of specialist domestic abuse services in Scotland, that will enable a fully fledged service of domestic abuse advice, as well as support with minimal additional risk to women. Along with the recommendation about future levels of payment and awareness raising, there was a very clear recommendation that resources should be included to improve any discussions within services about economic and financial abuse as a prevention tool that can work alongside fund.
Okay, thank you. Would Lindsay want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I would echo everything that Dr. Galinsky said, and the only thing I would reiterate in that is that it's a national service, so that there isn't inconsistency across the piece and across like a postcode lottery of sorts of where you can access this fund or not, but also that it remains something that is immediate and a cash fund. What we often find with certain grants and things is that it's offered in vouchers or it's offered as virtual cards, and those are inaccessible and really difficult to use for a lot of women, and particularly older women. So having that immediate access to cash to help in an emergency situation and access those essentials is really key and the most beneficial way of providing that support. And the only other thing I would add to that is that making sure that this fund is, that every kind of service is aware of this fund, where the touch points that women might go to, GP services, pharmacies, are these organisations, occupational therapists, carers that come into the home, are they all, part of it is the training, are they all aware of the signs and can recognise that, but are they also aware of this fund, and can they make professional referrals to this fund so that it's a really seamless and easy journey for the victim survivor to go through it, and having that third sector referral as well, so that, again, they don't have to tell the story over and over again. They can tell the first person that they speak to and then continue that journey from there.
Okay, so I'm not hearing any voices saying that other than rolling out nationally, reviewing the level of payment, making sure there's consistency, making sure there's appropriate awareness and signposting. I'm not seeing any particular calls to fundamentally change the fund as was existed with the pilot. Duffin, do you want to add anything in relation to that?
I mean, I'd like to add two things. I think we need to recognise the psychological benefit of the grant, in that it means that this, someone is listening and someone is recognising. So that has a real impact on then people coming forward, because they know that at least there's some support there, and it's open. I sort of tend to agree as well that cash payments are are a necessity. It allows people to do things instantly. So I think, looking at the system that can actually deliver that is of great benefit. I think that, the psychological issue is a major one. That I think that it's the additional benefit and added value that the pilot gave.
Okay, that's helpful. And as I said, I want to specifically look at both the UK and Scottish benefits system now. Maybe we could deal with them a wee bit separately. I don't want to put word in the witnesses' mouths, but have looked through the UK system works. Dr Glinsky, what works well, and what would also be helpful would be any clear points and matters you think needs to change to better support victim survivors when they wish to leave that economic abuse?
I'm afraid our experience of hearing from victim survivors and through our helpline and with the network is that things are not working very well in terms of social security for women who are looking to separate. Just quickly on some of the issues that have been highlighted, as we know, and I know as we have consistently pointed out around the joint payment into the household. This really does allow economic abuse to flourish. It means that a perpetrator can immediately have access to this money. It means that the victim survivor might never see the benefit that they have applied for and that they're entitled to, as well as their children might not be in receipt of it. So we're still asking for there to be automatic split payments in terms of having that, so that victim survivors do have an independent income of their own immediately. That directly feeds into the point of you need to have left the household, you need to have separated from the household in order to apply for universal credit within your own right. So that means that women or children are forced to leave, oftentimes with no economic or financial resources of their own whatsoever, after the point of having separated, then apply for universal credit, and then they're faced with a minimum of a 5-week wait. Now, people do not have access to cash, as we've been saying throughout. Economic abuse means that you do not have necessarily control of or access to any of your finances. So this means that women or children are often forced to live for 5 weeks or more with absolutely no money whatsoever. Oftentimes, one of the key issues around coercive control is isolation. So this idea of being able to call upon family and friends as well and borrow money is often not a reality for women and children. So it means that they are on their own. In addition to that, as I've said, women and children, when they do leave, they leave with very few finances. In that case, they may even seek hardship payments, but then they have to pay these back. So this means that you're oftentimes immediately in debt. As I mentioned before, there is an issue around coerced debt, which I'm happy to elaborate on in case it's relevant. But we're now seeing, even when you're applying for it, that way that it gets clawed back and the deductions are taken from the receipt of your universal credit means that women are immediately in debt, and it means that it is that much harder in order to try to achieve financial stability. And that is increasing as we learn more and more about economic abuse. We also see that perpetrators are able to make false claims around benefits. This means that money is halted while an investigation is ongoing. So saying that the victim survivor, for example, does not have the children. So that will stop any income from coming. And it means, again, that women and children are left without vital and necessary funds to survive. But I will stop there in case the other panel members would like to come in.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will do, and some points very well made. I don't want to get into the weeds of whether there should be a 5-week wait in the first place in relation to claimants for universal credit. That will lead to a very politicised line. But the idea of someone fleeing domestic abuse and economic abuse immediately being indebted and struggling to make a claim while still in that abusive household seems to be a significant issue. So would you be suggesting, Dr Glinsky, there should be a specific point of contact within UC or DWP where invariably almost always a woman is seeking to flee that abusive relationship, where they should be able to have a private, confidential claims pathway for universal credit, which wouldn't involve a 5-week wait either, so they can get their ducks in a row, if you like, before they leave that abusive household. And I didn't want to put words in your mouth, but we need to look at conclusions for the committee as much as identifying the issues. Is that something that would seem reasonable?
Sorry, you're talking about a dedicated person or a specialist claim? So I
suppose what I'm thinking about, if a woman is seriously considered leaving that economically abusive relationship, they need to make sure they're clear on their entitlements. they need to be able to make a claim independent of the abusive individual. They have to be able to do that privately. There needs to be expertise, and there needs not to be a 5-week wait to get access to cash. So I'm trying to look what a ethical and appropriate system would look like. Dr Glinsky, it could be something totally different, but our committee will have to make recommendations at some point. So what would that appropriate system look like?
I think that that should be a universal system regardless. As we've highlighted, many victim survivors are not aware that they're experiencing domestic abuse. Many people do not want to speak about it when they do try to phone for help, or are not aware that their service on the other line might be able to assist them with that. And in addition to that, as we've said, economic abuse, there's still a significant lack of awareness around it. So it is unlikely that someone is sitting there going, I'm experiencing economic abuse and I would like the separate pathway. I think it should be something that's available to absolutely everyone who's phoning, and it's then within the DWP to identify that there might be coercive control and that there has been in the past, or that there presently is, domestic abuse and financial abuse. This 5-week wait, it's not just detrimental and very harming to victim survivors of domestic abuse. This is a group of additional vulnerability. We're talking about what this does for the poorest families in Scotland as well, who need to separate. As we said, it's not just something that is limited necessarily to domestic abuse survivors, but this should be available. We've been in favour of scrapping the 5-week wait for universal credit since the beginning, since it was detailed that this would be introduced, and that applies to anyone who actually needs to access these resources.
Okay. Dr Glinsky, I would agree with you, but for clarity, but I'm just trying to the art of achievable in relation to committee recommendations. Can I turn to our other witnesses now? And if you want to add anything about the UK system, fine, but I do want to ask a question about the Scottish system. So, for example, I'd be keen to what improvements need to be made there. I'm thinking in particular around crisis grant and community care grants, where it's not a directive, but by and large you have to be without your income or on low income and be able to demonstrate that before you can access these grants. Of course, someone in an economically abusive relationship can't always evidence that, or may not even be aware they're in that situation. So maybe some changing criteria around the Scottish Welfare Fund, maybe one way of improving the system in Scotland. But in relation to Social Security Scotland or our local authorities, what works well and what could we improve? Mr Duffin?
Well, I think what works well is belief. When someone claims economic abuse, it's about believing that story or that narrative, and that gives then confidence to a person to sell more. And it goes back to my original point. One of my key original points is the burden of evidence that has to be amassed across the different services and different public services. So if there was some common agreement around that, and what is the burden of proof required, and it's also about believing that narrative, because that is the first courageous step and the first step that someone takes to actually seek help. If that belief isn't there, or that trust isn't there, then they will recoil. So it's about having that confidence, and it goes back to what all my colleagues have been saying. It's about awareness, training, trauma-informed, and believing.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay Cleland, any suggestions how we improve the system related to Social Security Scotland or our local authorities?
Yes, and I would agree with what the other panellists have said. It's about believing and also having that training and awareness to identify if someone has council tax debt, chargeable repairs debt, anything like that, that there's not just an acceptance that they're in this position and it's their own fault, or there's some sort of reason for it, actually going, are there signs of domestic abuse here, and what can we then do about that, and having that agreed commitment about what the burden of evidence is and what the pathway is for dealing with those kinds of debts. In terms of social security, I think we would agree that there's potentially issues around wait times for things, and understand the kind of art of the achievable and the possible, but certainly waiting kind of 6-7 weeks for decisions, never mind then for payments to come in, can be a real barrier. So perhaps if there was a way to expedite payments for different social security benefits, adult disability payment, pension age disability payment, if domestic abuse was identified, would be one really key and potentially easier step of ensuring that people who need that cash urgently can get that at a quicker rate. There's also something around uptake and tackling the stigma around social security update, particularly for older women. There's a cultural stigma potentially in some communities, and also, you know, the only time they've ever interacted with social security is for their state pension. It's an anticipated thing. Its eligibility requirements are you reach a certain age and that's it. So really raising awareness of what you're entitled to, how you can apply for these things, and where you can get support is that first step almost before you even get to applying for things and improving waiting times and having that kind of dedicated contact that you suggested. And that's also a great suggestion of having that dedicated contact, so you don't have to explain to people every time you phone or that they contact you that they're aware of, you know, not sending out a form, for example, to your address if you've applied for something. There's also perhaps coming to an agreement on what happens if you have someone, your partner, ex-partner, has been getting carers support payment for you, and then you move, you flee that situation, you now want someone else who's caring for you to take that on. What is the process for, is that person notified? Because they will get notified they're not receiving carer support payment anymore. They can then utilise that against the person. It's that ongoing abuse that Dr Glinsky talked about. So there really does need to be a kind of systematic review of how the system works in certain areas to improve that for women who are experiencing it.
Thank you for those very specific examples. That's helpful.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Marie McNair in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Thanks for your time. Jen, I'll come back to you, obviously, with regards to following up from my colleague's Bob's question on universal credit, and obviously, you know, the advance payment having to be paid back. Obviously, you're speaking as well about the 5-weekly wait. Obviously, in terms of domestic abuse, I mean, do you think that should be something that, you know, should be waived, that we shouldn't have to pay it back, given the kind of additional financial pressures that you mentioned earlier on?
In an ideal world, yes. It does not allow, the current system, the way it's set up, is a significant barrier. Having a minimum income with universal credit and having deductions from this, if you're already living on a minimum, what that does to your financial stability and independence is significant. It further deteriorates it. We also need to think about, as Stuart had mentioned, the psychological impact on this, because victim survivors are told by their partners that, you know, if they leave, they will not be able to survive, that they are dependent on the abusive partner. And when they then exit that relationship, they then enter a system that reinforces that. So having debts, and coerced debts in particular, that are no fault of your own or that you had no awareness about and then are forced to repay, this does mean that it creates a significant barrier, and it means that it really is continuing to limit the life choices and the options for women and children, and to be able to rebuild their lives after abuse.
No, absolutely. I'm very supportive as well of the, you know, the split payments as well. I think that would be really helpful for folk, as you obviously alluded to. Going on to kind of legal aid, I mean, what financial impact on victims of the current rules of legal aid? You kind of spoke about it a bit earlier, but what needs to change there? Just sorry, yourself, but I'm just saying with yourself, Jen, just now.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realise it would come directly back to me. No, I mean, the issues that we've highlighted around legal aid in our consultation, and I know there's a further inquiry into this, I think, in a few weeks' time, but really is around low access and eligibility to legal aid. I'm sure many of us will have seen the BBC article that was, I think, published 1 or 2 months ago that showed that a victim survivor had tried to phone 116 legal aid lawyers to get representation. And this is simply unacceptable. It's unacceptable for anyone who's seeking legal representation, but especially when, you know, we've already talked about the circumstances that women find themselves in upon separation, and the legal actions that need to be taken oftentimes to facilitate the separation. So finding representation is incredibly difficult. The other issue around legal aid is around the eligibility. So earning thresholds for eligibility is incredibly low. So So again, going back to women who are employed or who might have savings, they are then responsible for their legal representation. Now, I know I probably sound like a bit of a recording, but as I've said, economic abuse can start, continue, and escalate post-separation. And one of the most powerful ways to do this is through vexatious litigation by the ex-partner. So prolonged legal engagements, in particular around child contact, which we've been very active in highlighting at Scottish Women's Aid, and the effect that this has on women and children is significant. Survivors who do maybe have some savings are then forced to use those very minimal savings that potentially had been saved up in order to facilitate separation and find themselves spending it entirely on legal representation. And this can take years. It is, amongst coercive control, very difficult to save any sort of money. As we've said, part of it, the whole point of economic abuse is the restriction and exploitation and sabotage of money as well as economic resources. And as one victim survivor very powerfully said to us, that if you are the one with the money, you are the one with the power. So in terms of our recommendations of what we think needs to change is that legal aid services should be free for victim survivors of domestic abuse. There's been a review, the Evans review, I believe, of legal aid, and it contains the recommendation that solicitors providing publicly funded legal assistance should be located within a third sector organisation which have a significant civil case workload. And a very good example of best practice in that, of trauma-informed, free, domestic abuse competent support for legal support for victim survivors, is the Edinburgh Women's Aid Legal Service. In addition to legal aid services being free for victim survivors of domestic abuse, we would also like to see the removal of means testing. So means testing in the context of domestic abuse further disadvantages women and children. Legal services should be provided free for all women and children and young people experiencing domestic abuse, with no means test and no qualification on accessing this for women.
Thanks. It's certainly something we'll be looking at on another committee I sit on, inequalities in terms of legal aid, so I'll take your comments on board. Thank you. Did you want to come in, Lindsay? Sorry, I just noticed your hand up, sorry.
I'll declare an interest. I'll declare an interest. I sit on the Law Society of Scotland.
Oh, right, okay.
So, and I sit on the Quality Assurance of Legal Aid Committee. I think there are issues there around eligibility. Those on very meagre incomes lock themselves out of legal aid. So that is a huge barrier. Also, what we're seeing is, across Scotland, legal aid deserts. And these are even happening in central Scotland. It's not just the rural areas, it's happening in urban areas, because the costs of providing legal aid for solicitors is really restrictive. So solicitors are removing practices from that. So there are issues there about access to services. We've also seen, legal through the Scottish Legal Aid Board, the removal of in-court services in the Western Isles and in Edinburgh. So, there are issues there whereby how do you get access to those types of services for the most vulnerable and the most needed? Sorry for there.
No, absolutely. I know that Lindsay wanted to come in as well.
I would just absolutely echo everything that both of the panellists have said around access, and also the fact that even when someone does finally manage to find a solicitor that offers legal aid, as soon as someone mentions things like perhaps coerced wills, coerced power of attorney, which are things that potentially come up in later life, they don't have that specialist knowledge or training, or it adds further financial resource and complexity, so they're not willing to take on that case. So it's just another barrier that older women find when they're trying to access legal aid. The legal aid desert is certainly another thing that we hear very often, and that pushes the costs up of when actually finding a solicitor, even if it's not through legal aid, because there's just so little who are willing to take on these cases. The other thing I would add is that trying to actually find information on where you can get legal aid, the Edinburgh Women's Aid Legal Service, having that as an in-person thing that someone can go to and find out what's available and deal with that in person, is really invaluable to women who can't get online and look at a register and try and find these places. So actually having those services, other good examples I would say of best practice, kind of Govan Law Centre in South Side Glasgow do really good trauma-informed legal aid care, but that is one example of not many, I would say.
horrifying to read, you know, the women in the Highlands, that, you know, over 100 lawyers trying to get legal aid. It's absolutely appalling to hear that. I'll stick on yourself, Lindsay, in terms of, you know, financial services is reserved to the UK Government. What more can we do in the Scottish Government to influence the way financial services respond to economic abuse? And obviously, you've got a lot of experience with that.
I think certainly that Scottish Government has a lot of influence in terms of, even though powers are reserved, they have a lot of influence when they're speaking to financial institutions, regulators like the FCA. So using that influence to make recommendations where possible would be really valuable and helpful, and also ensuring that we don't kind of work in a silo on this, that this goes out with the work that this committee is doing, and it goes cross-government at a Scottish Government level, that, you know, any team or committee that is looking at something recognises domestic abuse as a factor in that, and how can they incorporate that within their work and within policy decision and strategy as well. And that will feed into things like, if we're doing work on digital inclusion and speaking to financial institutions around that, how does domestic abuse come into that? How can we support victim survivors there in that work as well? And just reiterating that this isn't a kind of topic that's stuck within social security and social security systems, but it's a wider topic, and how can we make sure it's recognised across that?
It's true.
Yeah,
I'm conscious of time. We've only got really another 5 minutes, and whilst I appreciate some of the evidence we're hearing is really, you know, invaluable in terms of the inquiry, there is still a few people wanting in, so if you could be as concise as possible, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of financial institutions, this goes back to work when I worked in the Republic of Ireland, where we introduced a basic bank account with a very low burden of evidence in terms of opening that enabled people to have a transactional account without all of that sort of issue. So that is a key thing. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Just one final question, obviously yourself, Lindsay, in terms of Age Scotland. I found in my own constituency, working alongside, you know, Women's Aid there, the kind of older women are coming forward, you know, that they're actually eventually getting the courage to leave in their 70s and 80s. Is there any of your services tailored to that age profile?
So we don't currently provide kind of specialist domestic abuse services, but what our helpline do is offer a wide variety of that holistic support that women will need with leaving. Benefits checks, income maximisation, help supporting with accessing housing, accessing care, whether that be specialist accommodation or arranging a social care package. We can help them with things like energy advice and how do you set up your own utilities and things. So that real kind of wraparound support available, and we offer that for all ages, and particularly with our helpline. It's a free national number. People who are not online utilise it. We get thousands of calls every single year around that. And we are seeing more come to us after they've kind of left that situation. We offer that. And we also are offering kind of in-person support with things like form filling for social security applications and things, so we can really do that tailored, deep engagement with people that need it.
Yeah,
okay, thanks very much.
Digital inclusion, so we could
sorry, I'm going to have to cut in.
That'd be great. Thank
sorry,
you.
Marie, I'm going to have to cut in here.
Okay,
thank you. I'm going to invite Liz Smith in. Thanks.
Yeah, just one very brief but nonetheless important question. Ms Clend, you were very interesting in a response to Mr MacDonald earlier in the session that you felt that there were inconsistencies across some of the agencies that were trying to support people in an abusive relationship, and perhaps across different local authorities as well. Can I ask if you are coming across any concerns that there are inconsistencies within the law, particularly when it comes to civil remedies for people in these circumstances? And I'm asking that question because obviously the Law Commission, the Scottish Law Commission asked just at the course of the beginning of this year for views to be fed back to them about whether there needs to be greater changes made to the law over these specific issues of civil remedies. And it was quite revealing. The people who came back were saying that there's a lot of issues. I think there were about 10 or 11 flagged up. So could you just outline if you feel that there are cases in law?
I think there are changes that are needed, and I think I'm involved in submitting evidence into that. So that will be forthcoming. But I think there are changes that are needed, and they're not huge legislative changes. They're more strategic changes and administrative changes that can be made without going through the whole legislative process.
I'll pursue that later. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Paul O'Kane. I know you've got several questions, Paul, but if you could try and roll that into one, it would be much appreciated, given the time constraints that we've got.
I certainly will, Convener. Really just to get a sense of the view of the Equally Safe programme, and I suppose particularly looking at the cost of leaving, and I suppose that not being hugely referred to within that piece of work. So perhaps just a reflection on that, if helpful.
Well, I mean, that question, is almost as how long is a piece of string, in a sense, because it depends on circumstances. It also depends on needs. And there is an element there whereby looking, making that choice to leave economic abuse there are a whole range of factors that need to be taken into account. I mean, there are issues around wages, salaries, mortgages, rental, children's needs, etc. So there is and that is a burden to look at. And when people are making those choices to leave an economic abuse situation, it's very difficult to be rational in that situation, and there is need for support in going through that approach. We've piloted a training programme, and it was very difficult to get funding for this, and it's about separating healthily. But it is an element of need in there because some people need to separate. But where do you go for guidance and support in order to take that forward? I'd also like to bring one issue in here as well, that we have a number of clients that have approached us for, and this is post-economic abuse from the LGBTIQ community, whereby economic abuse is seen and is on the uprise in that community. And there is an element there, and the costs that are associated with that are quite significant. And that's where, making an estimate over a year of around about 50,000 when you take in all the costs, not getting access to legal aid, having to go to private solicitors, having to look at a whole range of elements there. It can be as much as that.
And just for clarity, the COSLA Scottish Government strategy, Equally Safe, do you think it reflects some of those issues well, or do you think it needs to do more, particularly in terms of... Yeah. Lindsay?
I would say Equally Safe does reflect some of the stuff, in particular relating to older women. It talks about pension inequality, it talks about gender imbalance, kind of cultural norms. Where it doesn't kind of cover the scope is particularly around maybe housing costs and the additional costs of accessible housing, the first time in many decades having to have housing costs again, and the additional costs and worry that can cause. Doesn't mention kind of social security uptake, the difficulties in accessing that and the stigma surrounding that, and what that's linked to is digital exclusion and how that can be a major barrier for women in Scotland. In terms of the context, as Equally Safe does recognise that about a quarter of women experience economic abuse are aged over 60. So I think it's really important to highlight all of these additional barriers that women of that age group might face.
That's helpful, I think, to the committee, but I don't know if Jen has anything she wants to add on Equally Safe.
If you could, very briefly.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yes, no, that's fine. I mean, Equally Safe and the delivery plan is a robust and progressive strategy, and one of the benefits to it is that it is flexible. So as I've mentioned before, with tech abuse, we've looked at expanding that. So it's a flexible strategy that can accommodate changes to knowledge and practice as they arise. And I think economic and financial abuse and the cost of leaving is one such area. What the delivery plan does very well, and the strategy itself, is to highlight that, you know, violence against women as a cause and consequence of gender inequality. And there's an incredible paragraph in it in terms of the economic inequality that women face and how this, you know, perpetuates violence against women. So I think, as we've mentioned all throughout, you know, in terms of the deliverables, similar to tech abuse, having a deliverable on economic abuse could be included perhaps in subsequent strategy refreshes, something like we will improve our responses to the many forms of economic abuse and its harms. But that is, you know, well within the gift of Equally Safe and the current delivery plan.
Okay. Thank you very much. So that concludes our first panel session today. So can I just say thank you to all yous for joining us. It's been really interesting hearing from yous as well. So we'll now have a brief suspension to allow for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. I am pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses today. Vicky Fox, Policy and Participation Manager, Recovery House and Service Manager, All In for Change, who is joining us in the room, and Lee Valentine, Homelessness Advisor for South Lanarkshire Council, who is joining us online. So thank you very much for both joining us today. I'm now going to go straight into our questions, and I'm going to invite Liz Smith in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to committee. I think you may have heard a little bit of the last session when the witnesses were giving some evidence to suggest that there is a bit of inconsistency about some of the agency support, and I'd be interested to know what you feel in terms of the homelessness agencies in that regard as well, whether you think there are inconsistencies across different local authorities. But the other thing I would like to ask you is, in terms of the law and how the civil remedies are in place for people who have suffered really badly when it comes to domestic abuse, do you think there are specific changes that need to be discussed and suggested to the government? I don't mind who goes first. Ms Valentine, do you want to?
Yes, definitely. I can speak for there. I think there's challenges with civil remedies. Often by the point someone contacts the housing service in terms of making a homeless application, then they are at their last port of call. You know, they've already made that decision to leave, and you know the solutions available to them are limited at that point. So I would definitely welcome, you know, civil remedies, things that would include, you know, allowing people to remain in their home and potentially the perpetrator having to leave the family home, for example. That would prevent upheaval to children, whole family, the kind of support network round about them. And I think there's definitely more that could be done around that area.
And do you think that that problem is manifesting itself because the advice is not clear about what can happen and what support is available, or do you think there needs to be changes within the legal framework to allow that to happen?
I think that both. I think the awareness, I think the awareness of the solutions that are available to women needs to be more prominent and more available just in the kind of norm in every day, like anybody having that information and just knowing if you come into a situation and that's you need a solution quick, then how to access those solutions. My experience of this situation is that women only approach local authorities when they are at the end of the process and they need a solution and they need to get out of the family home and they need to move on quickly. And that's when they come and access kind of homelessness services. And
do you think there are inconsistencies across local authorities about how well that support is provided?
I think all authorities, they do the best job that they can with the resources that they have available in terms of providing services. Certainly in South Lanarkshire, we've had kind of partnership approaches with the third sector to kind of enhance our gender-based violence services. We've worked with Say Women, we've worked with Right There, we've worked with Blue Triangle. We work with Women's Aid in a big way in South Lanarkshire. We've had small initiatives. Our Alcohol and Drug Partnership have invested in a specific Women's Aid service. Those types of things are probably inconsistent across authorities because there's small initiatives within each authority based on the partnerships that are available. So I do think there's probably inconsistencies, but everybody is working as hard as they can with the resources they've got and are always looking for opportunities to kind of develop services that help women.
Thank you very much for that, Ms Fox.
Thank you. I think Lee's right. We've talked a lot about, within the team, about there being a really small window of opportunity, I guess, for when women have made a decision to leave a relationship that's maybe been ongoing, for weeks, months, years. And if the support and the right support isn't in place and available when the individual and the family need it, then there's a far more likelihood of return to the abusive relationship. So I've got personal experience of this, and I think that, there can be a lot of misinformation, a lot of better the devil you know. So I'm in this situation. It's not, it's far from great, but I know what I'm getting here if I approach a local authority, and a lot of people don't know what that means, what that looks like, what service they'll get when they go there, and we've also got examples of trying to support people to present as homeless, and then they've had the whole burden of proof placed on them, so they're not believed, and it's very, very triggering.
And is that misinformation a lack of joined up thinking, or is there any deliberate misinformation to try to push people away?
Yeah, I don't think it's deliberate. I think that local authorities are really up against it, and they have just such a lack of housing and a lack of resource, a lack of capacity to be able to provide the best person-centred support and to really spend time with people and get to know them. It's very much, trying to do as much as possible with often very little.
And can I just ask, in relation to the housing bill that's currently making its passage through the Parliament, is that giving you some hope that some of this can be resolved?
We're always hopeful, and we've been very involved in the recommendations, particularly the recommendations around homeless prevention as part of the team. I think one of our main concerns would be lack of resource that's attached to the bill, so more onus and more responsibilities, I guess, being placed on public sector bodies without adequate training and adequate personnel, I guess, to be able to make them as successful as they could be, because we really believe in them, we're really behind them. But I guess we would like to see more commitment behind them.
Thanks very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to invite Paul O'Kane in. Thanks.
I'm very grateful, Convener, and welcome to our panel this morning. I'm just keen to understand, I think, in terms of a number of issues. Convener, I just want to double check that it's the second section that you're covering this morning.
That we're looking at probably is around about debt collection, so it's in relation to rent arrears and whatnot as well.
That's helpful. I just didn't want to cut across any other colleague. Obviously, Liz Smith referred to the fact that the housing bill is coming through Parliament at the moment, and there's a number of actions within there that will put requirements onto, we know, social landlords, where perhaps there are issues around arrears that are linked to domestic abuse. So do you think actually we need to consider that more widely across the piece and look at things like, you know, council tax arrears, other issues in terms of public sector debt that are directly influenced and impacted by the situations that people are in?
Yeah, I mean, I think our position would be definitely, I guess when you're in that situation, debt's a debt, you know, so whether it be rent arrears, council tax debt, and I think that those debts in particular follow people to their new tenancy, and it can be really difficult to not only have that financial burden placed on you when you're trying to move on in your life, but also to still have the kind of emotional ties to that tenancy, you know, so you're getting through reminders, it's got the previous tenancy address on and everything like that, so you still feel quite tied to the place where the emotional or, the, you know, whatever type of abuse it was, you're still attached to that, I guess. So I think, yeah, any sort of additional flexibility that there could be around these types of debts, and I guess any sort of debts that have been accrued during abusive relationships. So there's a lot of coercive control around, like, taking out debt, credit card debt, taking out loans, and then the individual leaving that relationship has then got all that to deal with in the longer term.
And I wonder, Leah, I appreciate you'll have a view on this as well, but something that we've been looking at is the recommendation from Women's Aid, for example, around disregarding that debt that's outstanding, if you like, in terms of rent or council tax arrears when looking at emergency accommodation. Because I think we heard in the previous panel some of the challenges that exist when you know, you're trying to get suitable accommodation for someone who's leaving an abusive relationship, and actually they're penalised almost for that. So it would be good to get your perspective on that as well.
As when, you know, a household who has arrears for their social rented tenancy present as homeless or through housing options interview for a solution looking for temporary accommodation with a local authority, well, certainly South Lanarkshire, we wouldn't look at their arrears position in terms of whether that allowed them to access temporary accommodation or not. Our duty is to provide temporary accommodation where it's required. So that probably wouldn't, having those arrears in place wouldn't impact their ability to access temporary accommodation at all. What I was going to come back in terms of, we talked about that consistency earlier, and, you know, I think rent arrears is one thing, but the other big factor for quite a lot of women accessing services are rechargeable repairs, you know, where there's been damage to their property through the perpetrator. And, you know, that can be really significant in terms of value. And, you know, there's instances where, you know, certainly we've not taken that forward because it's recognised that it would be inappropriate, and it, you know, it's, you know, damaging to it's not a trauma-informed approach. And, you know, just to give a kind of bit of context and example, we had one relatively recently where it was £25,000 worth of damage, so a significant sum of money, and we're talking about women who are already, you know, in economic crisis, limited income. Do you know, and to know that that debt would have been there would have been completely inappropriate. But, you know, the property had been significantly damaged and painted black inside, like everything, furniture, kitchen worktops, toilet walls, everything painted black. So a really oppressive situation. So I suppose the ability to take those types of factors into account is something I would definitely advocate for going forward.
I think that's really helpful. Thanks,
okay.
Convener.
Yep, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Bob Dodison. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. I think one of the reasons we're working to both of you as witnesses this morning is we know there's the housing bill going through the Scottish Parliament, and that's been alluded to my colleague Paul O'Kane. But it's often been said we know what we need to do on the ground, and we could do some of that now. So can I ask both of you what we could do now on the ground to help prevent homelessness for victims and survivors? Maybe Vicky Fox, I could turn to you first.
Thank you. I mean, I think that the policy's all there, you know, and as I say, we're big advocates for the housing bill and fully in supportive of that. I think that the concern, I've already spoke a bit about capacity and resource attached, but a sort of implementation gap between what's in policy and I guess what's happening in real time on the ground. I think that we probably one of our priorities would be more training, which, as you rightly said, could be done now before the bill passes, more training and awareness for frontline services, including public bodies, but also third sector services, so that people can access the support when they need it. I think that we need more gender-specific accommodation, safe spaces for people, and that would include safe spaces for men fleeing domestic abuse as well as women. Shorter wait times in temporary accommodation, so people getting trapped in really unsuitable accommodation for maybe years at a time when they've already escaped horrific living situations to go there. And I've already spoke a bit about the burden of proof and people having to jump through a lot of the times unnecessary hoops and feeling like they're not being believed, particularly, as I think Dr. Jen had said earlier, particularly when they maybe don't have support networks around them and they don't have family and friends or anybody to advocate on their behalf.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very helpful for putting that on the record. Lee Valentine, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think if we're talking about homelessness prevention, probably greater investment in housing options advice. Do you know, that kind of first protocol? You know, I've mentioned earlier that women often come to us as a last resort, and at that point they are finding themselves homeless. And so the prevention activity that could have been done, it's too late in the day because they've made that decision, you know, they've left the home, and it's potentially too late to prevent homelessness, because preventing homelessness would mean keeping them in their family accommodation or their previous accommodation if we're looking at a true prevention approach. So I think housing options at a much earlier stage, you know, that awareness raising, you know, being everybody having access to information, advice around what your housing options could be, how you access them, what your opportunities are, you know, the advice and information around accessing benefits, you know, what to expect next. And definitely the kind of other option there is about that consistent approach. Certainly in South Lanarkshire, Ms Fox there had spoke about the burden of proof. When somebody does present as homeless and chooses to do so, and they suggest that it's because of domestic violence, then there is no burden of proof. We accept that, and you know, we make a very quick and early decision on their homelessness case. So a degree of consistency across authorities would be welcomed. You know, that would certainly be something that we could move forward for. And you know, when I look at our refuge accommodation in terms of women's aid, specific accommodation that meets the needs of women experiencing domestic abuse is very limited. 14% of our homeless applications are from women who have experienced domestic violence. That's a significant number. It's about 350 people a year, and we have 26 refuge units in South Lanarkshire, so I suppose it demonstrates the scale and context of the situation.
Thank you very much. Thank you both of you, very helpful. No further questions, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour. Thank you.
Again, thank you both for coming this morning. I want to just talk about the Scottish Welfare Fund, as emergency funding help for experiencing domestic abuse. Firstly, how effective is it, and what are the witnesses' views on the new guidance that's just been issued? Vicky, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know a lot about the new guidance that's just been issued. I guess that we've got some thoughts from frontline workers who have been helping people to access the welfare fund more recently. So it's obviously a really important safety net, and it assists people and helps support people in a lot of instances, but it isn't perfect. So there's been issues with accessing, or trying to put in an application, I guess. So it's mainly done via online platform, and not everybody has access to the internet. People fleeing domestic abuse sometimes don't have access to a phone that they can go online and put in an application. There is a phone number, I believe, for the Scottish Welfare Fund, but it's really difficult to get through to it. And it's also not an unlimited fund, so if an individual or a household's maybe made an application X amount of times over a set period, they're not always able to access it when they need it and they're fleeing domestic abuse. And it's not always available on the same day, so that people can't always get help on the same day that they need it, or even a decision on that same day.
Thank you. Lee, I don't know if you want to come in from a local authority perspective.
I would echo exactly what Ms Fox had said. In terms of the new guidance, I've got limited kind of knowledge on that in terms of working practice. But people accessing the Scottish Welfare Fund, it's an excellent fund, and it meets the needs of lots of people. But again, we'd be looking at, we could be doing more. We could, particularly what I notice is that as we come to the nearer year end every year, there's less available for people, particularly households presenting as homeless and having to access the welfare fund for white goods or furniture. There's recent examples of if you're a single person, instead of receiving, a two-seater and a chair, you're literally receiving a chair. And if you're going into a home, when it's empty, and this is all the belongings that you have, it's a stark environment and it's a stark experience for somebody. So I think, it's an excellent fund. It meets our needs. But again, we could be doing more. And the length of time and it takes to make an application is considerable, especially if somebody is having to do this covertly, without their partner or the person they're living with knowing what they're doing, then that can be quite challenging for them. And again, what Mrs Fox says is, doing it on your phone, again, some of the apps on the phones, it's not as easily accessible on a phone as it would be on a laptop or on a computer. So definitely those are the things I would echo.
Yeah, thank you both, that's really helpful. Discretionary housing payments is a useful fund which is set up to those leaving abusive partners. Again, to what extent, from your knowledge, does it work in practice? Lee, can I come to you to swap over this time?
Yeah, discretionary housing payments, excellent fund, and yes, we do use them in instances, for example, where there's somebody requiring, the rent payment to be the shortfall to be made up, or to cover arrears. They're an excellent opportunity to help people most in need, and we do make use of them.
I mean, I would agree with that. I think I think it would benefit from more awareness, I guess, around that as well, though, because I think particularly in the third sector, not everybody's fully aware of it or knows to make that as a suggestion to people that are looking for help. So I think probably within local authorities, then it's widely used, but within the third sector, a lot of people I've spoken to working in frontline services don't know about it or don't really know what it's for. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to invite Marie McNair in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I was going to ask Vicky if you're aware of any other funds available from local authorities that could help folk when leaving an abusive partner. I know in Western Bartonshire, my own constituency, it's the first council in Scotland to bring in a policy called No Home for Domestic Abuse, and they kind of work very closely with other partners within the council, particularly the Scottish Welfare Fund, etc., and also work with antisocial behaviour in terms of using their powers as well to, ensure people manage to stay in their properties if the perpetrator was moved on. Have you got any understanding of any other good practice that you're aware of within other local authorities that you could tell about today?
Yeah, I mean, I probably don't know enough to talk about specifics. I know that as part of All In for Change, when we've done our national road shows, there is a lot of really good practice going on, throughout Scotland. And I think that there's a lot of good practice that could be learned from and replicated in other local authorities. But yeah, specifics.
If you've got anything, if you don't mind following up in written submissions, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Convener.
Thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Gordon MacDonald in. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. We've spoken this morning already about the need for safe spaces, for suitable accommodation, and we need to prevent homelessness in the first place. But I wanted to ask you about individuals who have no recourse to public funds. What support is there out there for individuals who have no recourse to public funds? And maybe start with Lee.
Thanks very much. My stark answer would be there's limited support available for households who find them in that situation. Certainly within our own authority, where a household presents in that situation, we would be directing them to our social work service, because we wouldn't be able to provide them with temporary accommodation through our legal duty in terms of homelessness legislation, because they don't have access to public funds. Our social work department would assist them in the first instance for an emergency basis, and then refer on to appropriate other agencies like the Refugee Council.
You quite rightly pointed out that if there is children involved, or it's a vulnerable adult, social work can help out. But how often is that avenue used?
Regularly.
Right.
Regularly, I would say at least 2 or 3 times a month in our authority.
Okay. And what proportion of the people that are presenting with no access to public funds does that represent, would you say, for your authority?
I would say most of the households that present to us with no recourse to public funds are usually women with children, to be fair, a high percentage of them.
Okay. Vicky?
Not necessarily experiencing domestic abuse, but a high proportion of women and children.
Okay. Vicky?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've got examples of where people have in fact been entitled to public funds, but for various reasons, maybe due to language barriers or misunderstanding or lack of training, it's been assumed that they don't have access to public funds, and a lot of time and energy goes in from third sector agencies, I guess, to advocate on people's behalf to get their entitlement. So there can be a lot of assumptions made. I think that women on spousal visas who have no recourse to public funds can find it really difficult to navigate systems and to get any sort of support, I think, particularly when there aren't children involved. And as Lee says, it might be a smaller proportion, but when that is the case, there often is little or no sort of support, financial or otherwise, for people, which means that they're at risk of destitution and, all sorts of falling into, I guess, going back to abusive relationships because there isn't any other feasible option open to them. I think that access and support can be harder for EA nationals as well, who don't have any status, and refuge places are often funded by housing benefits. So if women have no recourse to public funds, it can be really difficult to find a safe space for them.
A lot of the legislation relating to migrant individuals who are fleeing domestic abuse is reserved to the Westminster Government. But is there anything the Scottish Government could do to improve the situation?
So I think there's a lot of recommendations within the Fairway report. I don't know, I can maybe forward that on after. So without going into intricacies of the sort of legislation and what's within the Scottish Government's gift, I think that there are things that could be done to support women or anyone indeed with no recourse to public funds. So I can maybe forward some of that.
That would be helpful. Yeah, that would be helpful. Thanks very much, Lee.
I suppose the only thing I'm thinking potentially would be that we talk about social work assisting vulnerable groups as well as those with children, and whether gender-based violence could be encompassed within that vulnerability going forward.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thanks. I was in the last session, I'm going to ask this to Lee, and I know from my own constituency at East Kilbrides the challenges that we faced in housing and homelessness as well. So I wanted to ask it, and we asked the question in the previous panel session, was about the realistic option for victims and survivors of domestic abuse to be able to stay in their own house whereby the perpetrator actually leaves. So I wanted to ask you if you've got any experience of that within South Lanarkshire, and if there's any good practices there in order to ensure their safety, which is at the heart of what we're trying to do.
There's limited examples of that because the difficulty is getting the perpetrator to voluntarily leave. I know your colleague had spoke about Western Bartonshire's policy, where there's policy in place to remove the perpetrator from the tenancy using antisocial behaviour legislation. However, we don't have that same position within South Lanarkshire. Anytime it has happened, it's been because the perps agreed to move on. What I would say is that from the consultation we've done quite a lot of consultation with women who have experienced domestic abuse within South Lanarkshire, and those women that we've spoken to have indicated that actually it's not their priority to remain in their home. There's a lot of memory, there's a lot of worry, concern, anxiety about remaining in the home, particularly because the perpetrator will know where they are. And I suppose that the challenge for women is, especially when they've got children and a support network within their local community, is they may not want to remain in that home, but it's a complete upheaval to their life to move to another area or another letting area that's close by, but they still could come across family, friends of the perp themselves, and so it's really challenging for women. I think we should be able to give them choice, and I think if there was other powers or other ways to, give people choice, then that's the big thing that needs to happen. Is women should have choice about their housing options. Should they be able to stay in their family home that and not upheaval their situation, or is it better for them to move on and start anew and start afresh? But it really should come down to choice.
Okay. And just on that, in terms of, I know from a housing aspect, Lee, but there's children there involved in certain circumstances. Do you have conversations with the schools in relation to that?
So when somebody presents as homeless, then there is a kind of automatic notification goes to schools about a child presenting as homeless. So we would only have conversations over and above that if it was at the request of the parent or the person presenting with the child that they would want us to do that with them. What I would say is we've got a really good service called Breaking the Cycle, which is a family support service, and it's very, very focused on providing support to families and making sure that they can navigate that journey, accessing the benefits, having the information they need to hand, and making the best decisions for them and supporting them through a difficult time.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. I don't know if you want to come in, Vicky, on just some of the questions I was asking Lee. It's not specific to South Lanarkshire, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably Lee's covered that there, so yeah.
Okay. I don't know, we're finished relatively sharpish, but I don't know if either Lee or Vicky want to come in on anything else that we may have missed off, or if there's any other member wishing to pose a question to the panel. No. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today, and that concludes our public business. Oh, sorry, my apologies before I finish. Lee wants to come in. I never noticed, sorry.
I had joined just the kind of the sort of latter part of your last session when you were talking about the fund to leave, and it was just to kind of, I suppose, promote and advocate for that opportunity for the fund to leave service. We were one of the authorities that were part of the pilot, and it definitely benefited the women that received it, and the feedback from that was really good. So it was just to kind of make sure that that was sort of noted, that that was a worthwhile project, and we are actually looking to continue it ourselves this year and look at more of the sort of monitoring arrangements around it, about the prevention work and about the homelessness journey, and the potential savings associated, as well as the kind of health and wellbeing benefits around it. So it was just to kind of promote that.
I know that's really helpful, Lee, and it's well and truly noted, so thank you for that. I'm now going to invite Marie McNair in. Thanks.
It's just on the back of your response, Lee, in terms of the funding you're talking about. Was that open to, women more recourse to public funds? Was it any discretion used there at all, or was it, mostly?
The fund was provided to Women's Aid rather than to the local authority, and Women's Aid administered the fund. I've got the report, but I don't think it breaks down into detail whether it was women that had no recourse to public funds. Certainly that was the kind of next element when we were going to trial it within South Lanarkshire through funding ourselves, would be to gain more of that monitoring information, to have a better understanding of who was supported, and cross-reference it, be able to triangulate it with our Prevent Ones and our HL1 homeless applications.
It's a big issue that we're all dealing with as MSPs and councillors, etc. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. So that concludes our public business for today. We will now move into private. Thank you.